The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
Hi, Tits Out Brigade. It's me, Anne. I wanted to let you know about a fundraiser that I'm doing all this month, the month of April 2023. Trans rights are under attack seemingly everywhere, particularly in the United States. That's been in the news lately, but it's an issue all over the place. And I, as a person, and this podcast as an entity, we stand with all trans people everywhere. And so to raise some money, I'm running this fundraiser all month called Tits Out for Trans Rights. So you can get all the details if you go to vulgarhistory.com/donate. That's vulgarhistory.com/donate. It's two-pronged, the fundraiser. So first of all, I'm raising money for the Trevor Project, which is an American organization that supports LGBTQ plus people. And then also I've got a new item in the merch store, which is an item featuring trans icon, the Chevalier Dayon, who I talked about in an episode last season with guest host Maya Dean. And all the proceeds from sales of the Chevalier Dayon merchandise this month is going to be donated to Point of Pride, which is another American organization that helps support trans people. If there's another organization that you're planning to support this month anyway, somewhere close to home, something that is meaningful to you that supports trans people, there's a form also on my website where you can just list what the donation was and who you gave the money to. So at the end of the month, I can give a grand total of how much the Tits Out Brigade was able to raise as part of this fundraiser. Also, for everybody who wants to, I will give you a shout out to all the people who donate in a later episode of Vulgar History. So again, you can get all the details of this fundraiser at vulgarhistory.com/donate. Tits Out for Trans Rights. Hello, welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a super special episode. So if you haven't listened to this podcast before, I am a person who says like a normal amount of times when I am doing these episodes. The whole point of this show is that I talk conversationally. It's called Vulgar History. Vulgar has kind of two meanings. One of them is the one that you're probably thinking of right now, which is kind of like vulgar. It's kind of like, distasteful. It's kind of scandalous. And that's one meaning I love. And that's one of the reasons I called my show that. But vulgar also initially meant like the common people, like the vulgar tongue meant just kind of like the way that normal everyday people spoke. And this show, I speak the way that I speak in my everyday life. I don't code switch when I do this show to suddenly talk like I'm on NPR or BBC World News. This is just how I talk. And for people who listen to this podcast, people who continue to listen to this podcast, obviously they're okay with that. Every now and then there are people who are not okay with that. And they're so not okay with that they leave bad reviews of the show, or they leave me strange comments on my social media, or they send me messages, quote unquote, helpfully, saying that I use the word like too much, or I say too much, and that sort of thing. And whatever, that's how I talk. If you don't like how I talk, listen to a different podcast. But this is why I was so excited when I heard about this book, the author of whom I'm going to share my interview with her in just a second. It's a book called Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. It's written by Valerie Fridland, who is a professor of linguistics in the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno. She writes a popular language blog on Psychology Today called Language in the Wild, and is also a professor for the Great Courses series. And in this book, she just kind of goes in a really kind and helpful and thoughtful way. She goes through various different things that bother people about current English, I guess American English, you would say, but using the word like, using and using the word dude, just all these different things that bother people. And she kind of goes into linguistically, why does this happen? And where did this come from? And why does it bother people? And it's such a really interesting book. She's a linguist, but she's a linguist and she's a university professor. And this book is written for the everyday person. It's not a textbook at all. I was so thrilled to talk to Valerie. Her cute boxer, her dog, makes an appearance towards the end, so you can look forward to that. But anyway, please, and I hope you will, enjoy this totally good conversation I have with Valerie Fridland. So Valerie Fridland, welcome to Vulgar History.
Thank you. I am truly excited to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you about everything that we're going to talk about. But first, can you describe what your book is? Your book has just come out.
Sure. I just wrote a book. I'm a sociolinguist, so I'm interested in language and how it changes over time, but especially with the social factors and how those influence it. So my book is called Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. And it's really about all those moments that we all have. And it really doesn't matter who we are. We all have them where we stop and we think, oh, I hate it when people say that. Or I'm so aware of me saying like all the time that it makes me self-conscious, when you say it about yourself. And we all have those things about language that I think a lot of people call pet peeves, are their insecurities or dislikes in other people's speech or our own. And I wanted to be able to make people more compassionate, both to themselves and others, by writing a book that tells people why we say these things, how they evolve. They're usually from a much richer and more complex history than we think, with our dismissive attitudes about them, and why they came into being, because they almost always serve a communicative purpose, and how they actually are good features rather than bad, despite the fact that we hate them so much. And so the book kind of dives into some of the background of sociolinguistics, but mainly every chapter is one of these tics that we love to hate. And I drew from my experience in talking to people and them telling me their least favored speech habits. So it's things like use that's used non-traditionally, literally used non-literally, singular they, which irks a lot of people. Things like saying dude and bro, those little things that we often hear people call each other, all those features. Every one is a chapter, and I go into the history, its evolution, its purpose, and the research behind it in terms of whether it's actually good for us or not.
And when I first contacted you about coming on the podcast, you had mentioned, I think it was a TED Talk that somebody afterwards was talking to you about about your voice, or I forget what was it, use of like or Can you share that story?
Yes. Well, it wasn't a TED Talk. I go to these conferences where it's sort of like TED Talks. It's kind of, they bring together thought leaders and then they ask you to give talks. And so I gave this talk, and probably about 200 people. And I had given this talk about sort of how we should be compassionate about language. And I gave some evolutionary history to what language does over time and why language change is part of our natural evolution, and who the leaders of linguistic change always are throughout history, and why we should embrace it and not dismiss it. But I did it in terms of vowel movements, and that's with an M, just in case, vowel movements. Sorry, with a V, not a B. And I talked all about how these changes represent evolution. And then I realized, when someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh my gosh, that was a fascinating talk, but can you tell people not to say like all the time?" I thought, have I not said anything up here that made sense to you? I mean, you just didn't listen, did you? But then I realized that actually I wasn't being fair, because as humans, we like to compartmentalize things, and people might see vowels as naturally evolutionary, and they might understand, okay, well, we obviously don't sound like we did when you listen to old movies. So, okay, I can accept our vowels change, and that's natural and okay. But when we see these features like or literally or so at the beginning of sentences that annoy us, we see those as individual isolated cases that are errors or mistakes or bad English. And so we don't understand that that's actually the same thing as what I was talking about. So I decided, well, let me give everyone, not just this person, the tools to see the relatedness between these larger forces I'm talking about in these talks that I was giving and those little things you hate every day in your speech, because they're actually the same things. They're the same processes. They're the same articulatory and psychological pressures that make us do them. They're the same social forces that drive us to them. And they're the same sort of value added to our speech as the reasons that we change our vowels over the time, or the reasons we don't say knicht anymore for the word night. Because over time we've lost certain sounds. I think people are accepting of that happening, but they're not accepting of other types of change. And I realized I hadn't sort of explicitly explained that in my talk. And so I could understand why people didn't maybe understand how what I was saying related to what they were thinking. And that really inspired me to write this book, that one man who asked me why I couldn't stop people from saying like. Now, of course, the other thing is, if I only had the power to halt language in its tracks, that would be a whole different conversation. But
what I would suggest, and I'm saying this very much tongue in cheek, but also not, is there is sort of like an unofficial militia of people who are policing the use of the word like, and they come into places like comments on podcasts, reviews on podcasts, as though someone like me doesn't know it's like, oh, did you know that you're not supposed to do that? It's like it's this weird policing. And I see it not just like in your book, you so many examples, like news anchors and NPR and all this stuff. Like there's people who just feel like it's their role in society to just, especially for women, like that's very much what I want to talk to you about. But the people who just step up to be like I gave a talk ages ago, and afterwards this woman came up and she's like, oh, that was so interesting what you said. But you do this up talk at the end of sentences, your voice goes up. And if you keep doing that, people aren't going to take you seriously. And I did not tell her, I'm like, well, I have a professional career. I have a master's degree. Like I'm a successful human being. Like what, who should I be trying to take me more seriously than I'm already being taken in my life?
And what gives you the authority to tell me what you think of my speech? I mean, that's what kills me about that. I cannot tell you how many stories like that I hear, mostly from women who have had people in professional settings like that come up to tell them what they should change about their voices. And would you go up to someone and say, I don't like your name, you need to change that? I mean, I think everybody would recognize that's totally inappropriate, but yet you're going to somebody's intensely personal vocal experience that is part of their personality and their identity and telling them to change it. And it's completely inappropriate. It's very much based on historical bias that we have, and it's almost always lobbed at women. Now, our young men get it too. It's lobbed at those who are the leaders in language change because we don't like what's new and novel. But it's also the idea that someone has the authority to tell you that. Who is this woman and why does she think she has the right to say it? It's so crazy to me how strongly we hang on to our beliefs about what's good and bad in language, when the really funny part is they're actually usually wrong. there are so many mistaken beliefs about what's right and what's wrong that the people that march up there to tell you that you're doing something bad don't even know that they're doing so many things in their speech that a century ago people would have scolded them for. And it's simply a matter of cultural moments that make us think our speech is better, and class bias and race bias and gender bias. I mean, those are the reasons that we police people's speech. And it's not compassionate. It's not seeking communicative efficiency or connection. There's nothing beneficial about it except him trying to make you feel better about your own self by criticizing someone else, which I think all of us can recognize is not a positive way to live. But yes, it irks me. I have heard so many stories about that, especially women in professional settings.
It stuck with me. This, like, and other people have said other things, but this one woman, like, she was coming up and it was so seemingly well-intentioned, and it's like she was concerned for me. It was like she was concerned, don't you know people won't take you seriously if you don't change the way you talk? And I thought, well, I was invited to give this talk. So
So obviously people did. No, and I think actually, I'm not trying to paint people that do this as these evil monsters. Honestly, most of us do it. Most of us have these beliefs about language, and it may be something entirely different that we react to and criticize someone for. I do think a lot of people, especially women, have been trained to act a certain way, both behaviorally and vocally. And we do think we're helping someone else when we call out things they do with their speech. And I don't think people are bad intentioned most of the time when they do this, but the reality is it has a bad result. And it's not based on anything that's historically valid. I think what they don't step back to see is the idea that somehow you come across as less certain or hesitant or powerless in your speech, which is sort of the assumption she was making, is based on the fact of who's been speaking in those positions for centuries, rather than there being any type of inherent hesitancy or uncertainty in any kind of speech feature, which there isn't. We come to language with different views about what it does for us, and every feature can be interpreted in different ways. So, young people like a lot. It's used a lot in their speech. And most young people don't see something wrong with it in terms of how they communicate every day to each other. Older speakers tend to really dislike that feature, but they don't understand the usage that young people use it for. There are actually 3 very specific purposes like is put toward. It helps with communicative efficiency. It is sort of allows a subjective sensibility and a stance that would be absent if it weren't included. It's not meaningless in any way, but if you don't understand how to use it yourself, you may not read it that way. But if you use it that way, you are reading it that way. So what we have is actually a mismatch in perception and use rather than either side doing something wrong. We're just born of a certain time and place and position, and we see the world through that lens. But sometimes we need to be a little more sensitive about the fact that maybe everybody doesn't use the same lens we do, and we shouldn't judge their speech according to it.
Well, I felt like there's so much interesting stuff in your book. I loved reading it. You gave me an early copy of it, so I was really excited to read it. And one of the things, I was especially interested in the chapter about because I think I told you that it's really weird to me. And it's not upsetting or distressing. It's just constantly strange to me when people say, you say like too much. And I thought, well, then don't listen to my podcast. Why are you telling me to change when you could just not listen to my podcast? Like the fact that people feel so strongly about it. But in your book, you talk about use of the word like, and it's going back to, it's not a thing that people just started doing now. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. People were doing it then. You talk about Valley Girl and things like that. But even if you look at the 70s, like Scooby-Doo, Shaggy is always saying, like, you go back to the Beatniks, like the 50s, they were saying, it's not. So people now who think, oh, young people are saying like too much, they've been saying like in these ways for 75 years. So why is it
more than that? Centuries.
Why is it still okay? Explain why do people think it's a new phenomenon?
One of the factors that goes into the way we notice language is the amount it's being used, and something called the recency illusion or the recency bias, which is when all of a sudden you start noticing something, you notice it seemingly everywhere. And that both of those things, this uptick in use, it's become more popular as a feature in American English particularly, and we've noticed it more because people have called our attention to it. those have contributed to this sort of idea that like is this new feature, this new epidemic that's coming into our language. But if you look back in history, like used as a discourse marker, which is where it goes either at the beginning of a sentence or sometimes in the middle of a sentence, has actually existed in English well before American speech really was a thing. It has been found in documents as far back as the 1700s, used in exactly the same way. Like as a word, so like as a verb, it has existed in English since about 1200. And then it morphed from a verb to also having an adjectival purpose, so swan-like, ape-like, that kind of thing. And then it morphed to having a prepositional and conjunctive use. And that seems to really have been where the like use as a discourse marker stems from. So if you say something like, she's like a sister to me, that's used as a preposition, that like. But if you say, she's like a sister to me, you can sense that you're using it there in the same place it would have been used as a preposition, but it's becoming slightly detached from the syntax in the emphatic tone. So you can see how it slowly starts to morph as being something a little separate from that sentence. And then what if you say, like, she's a sister to me? Where that same meaning of sort of this subjective similarity gets picked up and moved to the beginning of the sentence. So if you don't hate prepositions, you shouldn't hate like, because it's basically doing the same work. We've just detached it from its original position and moved it for the same purpose of a similarity, a comparison, and an approximation, which is exactly the same thing. So that has existed for even longer than the 1700s, that type of use where it's used for similarity. And then we see it in recordings done in the early 20th century of British speakers that were octogenarians and of New Zealanders that were in their 90s. So that means they were born in the middle of the 1800s that used like all the time in their speech as a sentence starter, as a discourse particle, just like you hear Valley Girl speech using like. And that suggests to us that it's British, and it followed the British wherever they colonized. And so this idea that like is new is a figment of our imagination. It's simply that we notice it now, probably because it caught on. And a lot of times we see these really low-level features in our speech that have been there for centuries, used just in the way that we're using them now. But all of a sudden, somebody imbues that feature with a quality that is enviable to others. And I think that's what happened in the Southern California use of like around the 80s and 90s. It became imbued with this sort of SoCal coastal hip, cool lifestyle. And that's what then made it something appealing to others to pick up. And that's when we started seeing it everywhere. And then we get this recency illusion, which is like, oh my God, it's everywhere. It just came into being. So it's a pretty cool evolution in the use of like, and it's also not just women that use it, even though we strongly believe that that's true.
I don't know if you've seen the movie The Banshees of Inisherin. Have you?
I have, yes. And I know I've mentioned that to several people and no one else has noticed. They use like all the time as a discourse marker.
All the time. I was watching that movie, which is like mostly about men and Irish men. The two main characters are men, and I watch everything with subtitles because that's how I like to watch things, especially things where people have accents. And so I was especially noticing every time they said like, and I told the person I was watching it with, I'm like, do you think people reviews of this movie and say they say like too much the way they do for my podcast? It's of course they don't, because it's a movie about men. Yeah.
I thought the same thing. I brought that up to several people. It's so funny. And everybody else was like, no, I didn't know. I'm like, oh my God, how could you not notice? They say it all the time. And they say it exactly. It's sort of usually for them, and this is probably the evolution of our like, is from these sort of little beginning and following sentence markers. So when we look at early British speech, the octogenarians that we studied, we see that they mainly use like at the beginning of a sentence. And then we see Irish English, they use it a lot at the end of a sentence, sort of as an emphatic marker. So something like, he was uneasy like. And in fact, one of the earliest, I think it was the earliest literary use of the word like, was in a woman's book. Frances Burney was the author. The History of Emily Montagu was the name of the text. And she says, father was uneasy like for fear of his lordship taking offense. And that is actually a very similar use to what we heard in the Banshees of Inisherin, that sort of mid-sentence or end of sentence emphatic marker or adjectival sort of ending. And it probably gets analyzed differently by different speakers, which is how it becomes detached from the syntax. But you're absolutely right. Where are the articles in the newspaper saying, oh my gosh, this movie was great, but the like was so distracting? Yeah. You don't see it. It's so funny. I noticed the exact same thing. I love it that you did.
I love that you did too. Because it was on my mind. And it was such a good example to me of what gets criticized and what doesn't. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you talk in your book, there's so many, I'm just looking at, I've got various like screenshots of like sentences that really just like resonated with me. But one of them, so I'm just looking at one that talks about women's speech has historically been disparaged as chatty, gossipy, and less topically important than men's, something many contemporary researchers in the field of language and gender studies have interrogated. So there's something, so I want to kind of like dive into that a bit, because people in general, in our society, don't like hearing women talk. And so I think it's like low hanging fruit. So again, like my podcast, if somebody says, oh, she says like too much, if I fixed that, quote unquote, if I stopped doing that, someone would say, oh, she has vocal fry. And if I change that, they'd say she talks too fast. Like there's always going to be something to criticize about a woman talking. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I mean, if we look through history back to antiquity, we find ancient philosophy texts that talk about women's voices not being appropriate for the public sphere, and that the best kind of woman was the one that was silent. In fact, Aristotle even has a statement, silence begets women, or something like that. I can't remember the exact quote. But even, back in thousands of years ago, back in earlier days, we didn't have women in public positions. We didn't have women in political positions. We didn't have women anywhere but the domestic sphere, which was where they were relegated. And so their conversations were not important to those of men. So talking about family, talking about life and health and the things that women in the domestic sphere were associated with, those things were not important to men who were, in the political and economic positions of running the country or running the family household or whatever. And so we see how that dismissiveness starts. But then we get into the Middle Ages and we find not only are women's voices unwelcomed in public spheres, but they start to be criminalized because women's voices can be very dangerous. We have something called intimate diversification with women, which is where we have women that are different than men, right? Men and women are considered different entities, different sort of physical and emotional bodies, but they live side by side with their opposites, which is why it's called intimate diversification, which is unlike segregation in other ways. So when we have ethnic differences, usually ethnic groups don't live together in this intimate relationship. And even age groups, other than when you're with your children, you don't really associate, in my age group, I'm not going to say what it is, but it's an older age group. I'm not going to hang out with a bunch of 20-year-olds. We just don't tend to do this kind of intimacy, but men and women do. And so women's voices are actually quite powerful because they have the ear of men in the domestic sphere. And those are actually pretty powerful voices. That gets noticed as being dangerous and subversive in the Middle Ages. And so in the late medieval period, we find that women were charged with 80 to 90% of the cases of sins of the tongue, which was basically spreading gossip or malicious conversation. Anybody who talked out of turn outside of the domestic sphere, so in the spinning circles, at the water corners, in the public squares, when women's voices were heard there, that's when they were most likely to be charged with these criminalized speech acts. And they were actually physically sort of stopped from speaking by these things called scold's bridles, which they would put in women's mouths, and it held their tongue down so they actually couldn't speak. And all you have to do is look at these, sort of sayings from hundreds of years ago to today that talk about women's tongues, right? They wag, they are dangerous, they're their devil's tongues. You hardly ever hear, well, what delightful things women's tongues are. It just doesn't exist, that kind of discussion. So we see this idea that women don't belong in public places or in professional spaces for thousands of years. So it's not surprising that whatever is in those spaces then gets valorized as appropriate to that spot, as strong, as powerful, because those are usually the places of power, of strength. And that doesn't mean there's some internal strength or power to it, but that means that's the external strength and power we put on it. And that's where we get mixed up. There's no such speech feature that is strong. There's no such speech feature that's uncertain. There's our belief in what those features do that embodies strength or weakness. And when we get used to certain people talking in certain positions, then the sound of someone else's voice, whether that's the sound of a woman or an ethnic group or a foreign accent, don't belong. They don't fit in. And we consider them powerless, weak, and unwelcomed, even though that's not a conscious thought we put on it. We perceive that as too much, which is one of the reasons why we look at women's voices as being omnipresent and everywhere, right? If you ask someone in a meeting or in a school room who does most talking, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you it's a woman. But when you look at studies that actually look at who does most of the talking in those contexts, it is never a woman. Women might talk more in our social environments, although I think that's hard to establish if that's in fact true, but that may be more true of our experience. But when you measure speech in professional context or in schoolrooms, most of the research suggests that it's actually boys that talk more in schoolrooms and men that talk more in professional contexts. But yet, if you ask people in those same contexts who's doing more talking, it's women, because we know they stand out. Right? We notice exceptions. We don't notice the norm. And women are exceptional in professional and educational and other sort of public spaces. And that's why we notice what they do. The other side of this is not only do we notice those voices more because they're not usually there, and we've historically not wanted them there, we also notice them more because women have for centuries been on the forefront of linguistic change. In almost every major change that has happened to our language over time, it seems that women are the stylistic leaders that move it forward, which means that women are usually at least a generation ahead of young women are, in whatever linguistic change is coming up, which is why we find this pattern of associated novelties in speech with women. It's not because they're flighty and vacuous, which is why they're usually assumed to be saying those things. It's because they're linguistic leaders and they're a generation or two ahead of men. So in 30 years, we won't notice that, right? We'll say, okay, this is just what everybody does, because by then men have caught up and it's not noticeable anymore. But when women are doing it more, which we find with things like literally, non-literally, using like, vocal fry, then we call it out because we already don't like women's voices in those areas. And then they're doing these new things we also don't like because they're new. So it's a kind of double whammy for women.
Yeah, and you talk about vocal fry in your book as well, which I find that really interesting as well, because you mentioned like Margaret Thatcher or Elizabeth Holmes, women who consciously lowered their voice to be taken more seriously. And a result of that, if anyone who speaks in a low voice, there's going to be that rumbling, sort of crackly sound. And men have it too, but it's just when women, so that's another way where it's like, oh, I don't like women that their voices are so high pitched. Then a woman talks in a low voice. It's like, oh, I don't like that. She's talking in a low voice. It's like, okay, you just don't like women talking. That's what's happening.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly right. And it's not even that conscious. I think I'm not trying to make people out, and I don't think you are, as these sort of conscious haters of women's.
No, it's all so subconscious. Yeah.
Subconscious. And it's just our reaction. But what we don't realize is we're reacting that way because of these low-level historical and social pressures and norms that we have had operating on us all our lives. And we're socialized into these ideas that then are so pervasive that we misconstrue them as ideas of right and wrong.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hello, my name is Alison Larkin, and I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast. This podcast brings Jane Austen's stories to the 21st century, along with commentary from me and conversations with fascinating people who all share a love of Jane Austen. And of course, we had to start with none other than Pride and Prejudice. So join me as we embark on a journey through some of the most wonderful stories I know. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. I think it's a similar thing to people who are policing. And again, it happens to young women as well, which is like, oh, you really shouldn't wear a crop top. You really shouldn't wear a miniskirt. People won't take you seriously. It's somebody thinking, like someone who has really either gotten in trouble about that when they were younger, or they just feel like, no, I'm looking out for you. I want you to be taken seriously. And here's how you can do that. Where it's just like, or what if a woman with vocal fry and a crop top comes up and defends her PhD thesis brilliantly and says the word like a lot? How is that a problem? If it's that. Yeah.
Right. If you can get past dismissing the person for the speech features you don't like, and that's what we find happens over and over again. People just don't listen to those who do something they think is inappropriate linguistically or stylistically, and unfortunately, that really just obscures really good diversity of opinion, thoughts, ideas that we just dismiss because we don't like how they're delivered. And usually that ends up quieting or silencing the woman's voice more often than the man's.
Well, and I want to point out too, and that also ends up like in an intersectional way that ends up quieting somebody, like you said, with an accent, like Black people who have like African-American vernacular, things like that, where it's, code switching. We talk about that. There was it just came out. It was an American lawmaker. There was this like fake scandal about, look at him in his campaign ad. He spoke in this very quote unquote eloquent way. And then he speaks in more of African-American vernacular way. It's like he's fake. It's like, no, he knows that this is how he needs to talk in this context, and this is how he needs to talk in this other context. He's the same person. He's just as capable. He's just as smart. But it's, the code switching, I think, is interesting too.
Right. Well, and we all have a linguistic repertoire. If we spoke the same way in all contexts, then it would come across inappropriately in most of those. You wouldn't want to go hang out with your friends and talk like you talk at work. And you wouldn't want to go talk to your boss like you talk to your friends. What we don't realize is this repertoire that we operate within is just bigger for some speakers than others. And most of the time, it's bigger for those that have been forced to accommodate to someone's norms that aren't their own. And that means either bidialectal or bilingual. And what all that says is that you actually have a broader range than other people. It doesn't make you inauthentic any more than you're inauthentic when you go talk to your boss and you're not using like and dude all the time, because you've style shifted to be more professional in what you think they want. And then you go home and you talk to your friends and it's completely informal and you're dropping your G's and you're saying dude all the time or whatever you might be doing. It's our repertoire, and it is what allows us to make connections in different ways in our daily lives. And we all do it. So it's really funny that people get upset and call it inauthentic. I'm not a fan of Elizabeth Holmes. I don't think that what she did was right. But that said, I also think it's very odd how upset people are about her voice. I mean, is that really the biggest problem we have with her, that she uses a lower voice? That may be very well part of her natural repertoire. But again, like you said, if she had a high voice, she wouldn't be taken seriously. But with a low voice, we're knocking her for being inauthentic. So you can't win. In the same way that this gentleman was knocked for having an African-American English bent to his speech in his casual everyday speech and doing it less when he's not in that context. So here people are doing exactly what we asked them to do, which is shift to this more formal standard style that we want in people, and then we criticize them when they do it. So it's a no-win situation.
Exactly. So it's such a, and that's where what you're talking about, the subconscious, the unconscious bias about it. It's if you see a person, you're like, oh, I just don't like that hairstyle. I just don't like the way they talk. It's like, no, you just don't like, subconsciously, you don't like the fact that this is their ethnicity. You don't like the fact that they're an immigrant. Like, that's what it is. But if you can pull on something that is like more obvious, then you can, oh, I don't like that she says like all the time. It's such an easy way to just dismiss someone. And I just have another quote from your book that I was just looking at, where you're talking about, I think it's from the part about vocal fry, but it really speaks to a lot of other stuff you talk about. You say, there's nothing inherently gentle, dumb, sultry, or unprofessional about someone because of how they sound. Can you talk about that, about how the way that someone talks and how that can be, how some of the things, oh, that means this is what they're like because this is how they talk.
It's a trigger for stereotypes. That's what basically happens with speech. It is actually a trigger for stereotypes. And what we do is we associate the qualities that we put on the speakers that we think use those features with the feature themselves. And that's both why we judge people in ways that are negative, but it's also why we appropriate speech features in many cases. So one of the, I think, great examples of this is how young white men have really embraced hip hop speech and African-American English and appropriated it for their own speech, not because that's natural to their speech dialect, but because of what it represents to them. And it represents not actually what African-American English speakers are like, but what young white men stereotypes about young Black men are like. And so the reason young white men, particularly in high school and things like that, adopt those features is because it comes loaded with these assigned attributes like tough, physical, macho, dangerous, subversive, which are not true of young Black men that use those features. That's not why they're using those features. That's what white men or white people often believe about Black people, that though they're dangerous, they're subversive, they're culturally different, they're physical, they're powerful, they're macho. And that we put those on the features they use. They don't put those on the features they use. They use those features because they are in communities where solidarity and in-group membership is very important, because they're in a space that is in opposition to dominant mainstream speech norms that positions them as needing to have power within their own community from alternative forms of prestige, which come from connecting as a group, connecting your culture, your history. And you do that through language the same way we do. The same way that when you go abroad and you meet someone else with an American accent, even though you just came from America, all of a sudden you feel connected to that person, right? How many times have you been, in Italy or wherever, and all of a sudden you meet an American who you should be running from, because the whole point is you're there to get culture, Italian culture, but instead you're like, oh my gosh, you're from Milwaukee, so am I. That kind of connection. That's what language gives us. The closer our language, the more tied to other people we feel. And so that's why people use different dialect features, because they come to represent solidarity, intimacy, community. And when we start then misappropriating that because of qualities we put on it based on our stereotypes about those speakers, and then we use that to judge them. So then those features become emblematic of being tough and uneducated and dangerous. Well, that's not fair because those are stereotypes that speech features trigger because we put them on those speech features. So it has nothing to do with the speakers themselves, right? That they're actually that way, and everything to do with our stereotypes about those speakers. And we do the same thing with women.
Yeah. That I don't know. I don't think this was in your book, and I don't know if this is something you studied, but I'm curious about it. The difference between different kinds of American English, like African American vernacular English, versus, I don't know what you would call it, NPR, white people English. And then when you look at cultures, Chinese, for instance, there's Mandarin and there's Cantonese, where it's the same root language. Like, at what point does a vernacular become so distinct that it's a dialect and it eventually becomes its own language? Do you know, can you explain that?
Yes. Well, that's a really interesting question. And I actually always talk about that as sort of one of my initial conversations about society and language in one of my classes. So the difference between a language and dialect is actually a very difficult one to discern on linguistic grounds, because you have languages like Cantonese and Mandarin that are mutually unintelligible. The only thing that binds those languages together is they have a shared writing system, but they're actually not the same language. You can't understand each other if you don't know the other's dialect. They're mutually unintelligible. Then you have things like, Southern English and Northern English that are very mutually intelligible, or British English and American English that are also mutually intelligible, but they have differences. And so where does that happen, right? How do we go from being a German language at one point and now not understanding German? And that is a slow process that happens over time and is based partially on linguistic divergence. So the more forms that you develop in isolation from each other, the more distinct your dialect becomes. And then at one point, you get so different that you're linguistically unintelligible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a different language yet, because look at Chinese. They consider that the same language. What really determines the difference between a language and dialect is the Army and the Navy. So what social forces claim it to be a language versus a dialect. And usually those in power claim it as a language, and those without power end up with a dialect. And when that dialect becomes its own power, then it becomes a separate language, which is sort of what has happened in a number of places. Like when you get what used to be Serbo-Croatian is now Serbian and Croatian. What used to be Hindi-Urdu is now Hindi and Urdu. And that's because of political divides that have developed over time that have made those languages separate, and then try to encourage the adoption of different types of loan words, of different divisions in sort of naturally occurring changes, so that they become more distant over time in a very conscious way. So there's really no one answer to that question. It's social forces, historical forces, and linguistic forces that come together at certain times and places, and someone says, this is a language.
Yeah. And I think where I was thinking about that, well, first of all, I've been studying this season on my podcast about Scotland. And that's where I learned about Scots English. And I thought, oh, that's a separate thing. Very much so.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And, actually, if you look at literature from the 1700s in Britain, the Scots language was treated with such disdain. The commentary on all the Scots coming to London and ruining the language, it was stunning to me when you look at that literature. It was really considered a bastard tongue. But to the Scots, it was considered a sort of statement of separation and value and solidarity and community. So that's where we see the value of language is far beyond power. It's about solidarity and community and sort of brotherhood and sisterhood. It's about connecting to others that are more like you and dismissing and separating from others that are less like you. And actually, a lot of really interesting features in American English are Scots-Irish in origin, and particularly in the South. So if you've ever heard people say, I could do that, that's actually a Scots-Irish feature. Or y'all is suggested to have come from a Scots-Irish feature as well.
No, that's interesting. It reminds me of, I'm in Canada, and there's a theory. So Newfoundland is just, geographically separate from the rest of Canada. And they have a very strong culture that is different from anywhere else in Canada. And they have a very different accent that's different from everywhere else in Canada. And I've heard a theory that it's because they were just sort of isolated, the British colonizers came there and because they weren't interacting with anyone else. So that might be the most similar to like a Shakespearean English accent, is how they talk in Newfoundland.
Yes, well, they say the same about Appalachia, right? That it has a lot of Shakespearean features because of its isolation. And we do find that isolation does really foster linguistic developments that move away from that in other areas. Whether, the idea of Shakespearean English is sort of a funny one. And actually, a lot of American English could be claimed to be more Shakespearean than British English, because we do a lot of features that were true of Shakespeare's day, but are no longer true in British English. So, for example, Shakespeare would have had all his R's at the time and not dropped his R's like a lot of British English speakers do, like "pock the caw." That would not have been a thing in Shakespeare's day. And that's part of the reason why Americans don't have that kind of R dropping. But things change still, and they just change in different directions. And while there might be some remnant features of more Shakespearean style English in Appalachia and where you are, other features have changed drastically in other directions to make that dialect just diverge more. And what we find is isolation really contributes to dialect divergence. And that doesn't mean geographic isolation only. More often, it's social isolation. And when we get any group of speakers separated from another group of speakers, over time, natural, inherent psychological and physiological pressures that exist in language at all times will move those two dialects further apart until over centuries, they might even be diverged so much they're not intelligible. And, a great example is the loss of R in British English and the keeping of R in American English. That's actually an underlying tendency. Left to its own devices, if we had no social forces, language would probably get rid of liquid sounds, which is L and R, because they kind of mess with syllabic structure. When you have an L or an R at the end of a word, not at the beginning of the words, but at the end of the words, they're very vowel-like. They're kind of heavy, if you want to call them. Vowels are the heaviest sound, just to make it in a way that people can understand that they don't have phonetics backgrounds. Vowels are very heavy, which is why they are what syllables are. So when you remember that little game you used to do in kindergarten where you'd be like clapping the syllables of your name, Valerie, it's actually the vowels you're clapping. If you notice, syllables are always a vowel. And other things might be on it, but there has to be a vowel for something to be a syllable. That's because syllables are heavy. Well, R's and L's are also heavy. They're not as heavy as vowels, but they're still heavier than sounds like T, D, S. When you put a vowel and a heavy sound together, it actually changes the syllable weight. It makes the syllable heavier. And languages don't tend to like heavy syllables because we like our ends of syllables to be light and our beginnings of syllables to be heavy. So L's and R's at the beginning of words don't ever get dropped off. They often get dropped off at the end of words. That's a natural tendency to lighten the syllable. So that's a psychological preference. So it would happen naturally over evolutionary times. What happens, though, is social forces get involved, where it's considered either a low-class, icky feature, and so people avoid it when they are ascribing to standard norms, or it gets somehow associated with this prestigious group, and then people all want to do it because it makes them sound prestigious. And it's as simple as that. What makes one feature prestigious one place and not prestigious another place? And here we have an example of this underlying tendency in British English after Shakespeare's day that started to get associated with prestige. Now, interestingly enough, it started in probably northern, like Scots and Irish dialects and northern British dialects, and got imported into London with mass migrations that was happening during the Industrial Revolution. And as those features started to kind of get picked up by women, it seems, and then brought home and used in casual, informal context, it sort of got imbued with this kind of cool, hip, in the 1700s sense, and then got picked up in the court. And that's how it became a valued speech feature over time. But in American speech, that didn't happen. That simply didn't. It got resisted. People kept their R's. There was a pressure sort of on the opposite that was part of American identity. And so we kept our R's. So here you have the same, but you still see hints of it. So, for example, the word bust and the word cuss are actually examples of words where the R was deleted. Those are both from curse and burst. And those are underlying tendencies that exist in American English too, and that's why we have those words. And ass instead of arse, same exact process. So it clearly existed here, but we sort of resisted it due to different social forces. And the only reason we have R's and British speakers don't is because social forces made it so. The underlying tendency existed in both places. So what happens is if you have a bunch of these over centuries, a bunch of these little changes, you end up with different languages over time.
What do you think the effect is these days? And I don't know how much different it is now from maybe 25 years ago, but that people are exposed to so many different kinds of people's voices. I guess it is different now, like TikTok and things. Like I'm seeing people from all different countries, all different accents. So suddenly versus 100 years ago, let's say, you would talk to the people in your city, and unless you move to another city, you might not know what they even sound like there. But so what's the effect that you could see that having?
Well, that's an interesting question. And actually, if you look back in the history of American English, you actually, the idea of a melting pot was true. So I'm not sure it was really true that in cities back 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you weren't exposed to a lot of people with different accents, because actually that was when we had more first generation.
Because immigration and stuff. Yeah.
Yes. So immigration was definitely there, and we didn't have ways to sort of separate ourselves the same way we do now, right? You didn't have big houses and big lawns and lots of space between you. In fact, if you look at New York, for example, with tenement housing, people were on top of each other from different immigrant places. But whether wealthy white people had that kind of interaction is different. And so I think you're right that there is more exposure to that kind of thing. The difference being that exposure to things on social media and television doesn't seem to have the same kind of powerful effect that interaction in a human face-to-face context does, which is why babies don't pick up language from TV. So I don't care how many baby Einstein, French records you play for your baby, they're not going to speak French by 3. If you put a French speaker in the house that talks to them in French, they will speak French by 3. So there's clearly a substantive difference between listening to something in this sort of non-interactive way, watching it, and being interactive with it. And that seems to be very important to the transmission of language and norms. That said, what social media does seem to do is help spread underlying tendencies that are already existing in language and making people do them more. And certainly spreads vocabulary. So I think absolutely vocabulary words go viral much faster than they used to. But whether that's a meaningful kind of language change is hard to say, because vocabulary is very superficial. It's easy to pick up. How many of us pick up accents from watching TV? Probably quite few, unless there was already an underlying tendency towards that feature in that existing speech community. But what we do see in studies that look at exposure, and they looked at exposure in terms of actual social networks, so people you talk to in your real day, your life, not on TV. We do find that exposure to greater diversity in your social network, and that's usually in terms of languages or dialects, does make you a more compassionate listener, and it makes you better able to find speech that's not your own speech variety, intelligible and non-accented. So it does definitely have a benefit to be exposed to more speech. Whether we'll find that to be true of people being exposed to social media and all these different voices, I don't know, but it's quite possible. I think that it could make us a little more compassionate about language differences unconsciously, because we have been trained to do it by listening to so many different voices.
That reminds me of a question that I've been trying to formulate in my mind, but what you just said really, I think, helps explain it, is that the difference between, so somebody who decides to speak, like a white person who decides to speak with African-American vernacular, like somebody like Rachel Dolezal, like somebody who's trying to come off like, but people who actually grew up with that speech pattern can spot the inconsistencies. Because if you're not, so what you were saying about like if there's a French speaker in the home, then you would pick up the way that it works, the rules of the grammar versus
the real rules. Yes.
Yeah. If you just listen to like rap songs or something, you just be like, okay, yeah, I got it. Or it's like, no, you're using it wrong. Like there's something inherent if you're not actually interacting with the speaker. You just wouldn't get those like unspoken rules, right?
The small, subtle differences that actually define a real dialect, that's absolutely true. I mean, children are incredibly good at picking up distributions of and feature patterns in language and learning those, which is why we find that languages with small numbers of speakers, like indigenous languages that have really tight-knit speaker groups, and the transmission is always from parent to child, not adult to adult, they tend to have much more complexity than languages like English that are spoken by millions of speakers, because the transmission of these really complex rules has to be done by parent to child. That seems to be required because those children can do that really complex statistical and distributional analysis as babies, as young people. We don't do that anymore as adults. And when you're just exposed to limited amounts of data from another adult speaker, you absolutely can't do it. What you can do is pick up on the salient things that you might notice, which is why a lot of non-Southerners, for example, say y'all. And, if you've noticed anybody who puts on a Southern accent, they're not authentic, but they do get traits that we all recognize. So drawling, for example, longer duration of vowels is true of the South, and using things like y'all, merging words like pin and pen. But I might be able to say, yeah, can you hand me that pen in one context? But I probably don't understand that actually it's not just in pin and pen. It's in any words where a I or an E vowel precede a nasal. So the word like since and the word sense for a Southerner would be merged. But someone putting on that accent wouldn't know that because they don't know the rule. And the rule is what does it for a Southern speaker. The individual item that's been memorized is what does it for someone putting on that accent. So that's why we can notice the difference between someone who's authentic and someone who's inauthentic.
And well, that's just like, actors who put on, and it's various success, like actors putting on an accent for a film. People who are from that place sometimes are like, whoa, that was like, I wouldn't have known she wasn't from there, versus like, ugh, that's not it. Yeah.
Yeah, some people are better at it than others. And I think people often forget about actors is their acting. That's not their natural voice. And if they were just to use those speech features in everyday speech, it would be too hard cognitively for them to constantly monitor their speech to change it in the right way. When you're acting, you're actually in front of a camera and you get to take it 50 million times. So you're really consciously altering your voice every moment that you're speaking. That's untenable. That's untenable in daily life, which is why it sets us up for failure when we're telling people to talk a certain way, because in your daily life, you can't do it. And if you use a TV actor or a movie actor as a model for that, well, you don't get 50 takes to get it right in your everyday talking voice. And when you see those same actors on a late night show or something, they're never talking in that accent. They're using their authentic voice because that's what they have to do when they're talking spontaneously, because otherwise the conscious monitoring. And certainly some people are better at altering their voice in certain directions than others. And so that's why you have really good examples of actors copying a different kind of accent and really bad examples.
Well, and I think the good examples too often are people who have a family member or somebody who they know who actually speaks like that, and they're able to emulate them, because then they would have that inherent understanding of it that you can't learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. If you have that model, it helps you out greatly.
Related to that, and getting back to just because we are going to wrap this up, as much as I love to talk to you for hours, getting back to the like of it all, it's similar to what you were just saying, is some of the comments that I see, not just on my stuff, but other people's stuff. If someone's criticizing that someone says like too much, they try to be funny in the sentence. They put, for instance, she says like a lot, and that's not how I use it. That's not how anyone uses it. It's somebody who doesn't understand how it's supposed to be used, who doesn't understand how I'm using it.
Right. And they're mocking you, kind of. It's more of a mockery than an actual legitimate use. And, I've actually had people on interviews play for me segments of young women's speech where they're saying like a lot. And I'm not arguing that every use of like is fabulous, that we love someone who really uses a lot of a feature. But, it's the same with any word. If I use any word constantly, it's going to be noticed. And so a lot of people use things like and a lot, and they're just heavier ummers and ers than others. And so sometimes people that don't use it to that level find that distracting. And that may be true. It might be distracting. I'm not saying that no one ever uses like in a way that's not distracting, because I found sometimes people dismiss the reality of like because they point to people that are extreme users of it, but that's not the majority of people. Most of us use like in a very patterned, moderate way. And there are three main patterns that you use like when you're using it as a discourse marker or a quotative that are the ones that are sort of less traditional. And that's either as an approximator, where you're using it in a one-to-one substitution for about, or it's, so that would be something such as he's like 10 years old, right? And there's nothing useless about that. It's simply that you're using it one-to-one for where as an older speaker might use about. So it's funny that we say it's useless, because it's not. It's as useful as about. The other example is as a discourse particle or a discourse marker. And that's where you hear it at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence. And that's usually used for emphasis or to convey my boxer is crying. Come here. You can come talk to me. Come here. You can talk to me. But you're using it as a subjective sort of particle to tell people this is not exact. There's an inexactness in what I'm telling you to the actual moment I'm describing. And I want to point that out by using like. So it's sort of an indicator of subjective sensibility. And then in its quotative use, which is where it's used instead of the verb to say, again, it's a one-to-one substitution for the verb say. So, all right, come here, boxer. It's a one-to-one substitution. So you might use it instead to say, I'm not verbatim saying this, but I'm giving you the gist. Again, it's also subjective sensibility. So I don't know why people say it's useless and it doesn't have a meaning, because in two of the cases, it is an exact substitution for a word that American English speakers would say does have a meaning. So what you're really reacting to in those cases is who's using it and that you don't like it. You're not reacting to it's truly being meaningless or uncertain, because is about meaningless and uncertain? Is the verb to say meaningless and uncertain? And if those are not, then it's illogical to claim that like is when it's used as a one-to-one substitution for those exact same words. And it's just a funny thing that we pay attention to only certain aspects of like and ignore all the others that might argue something different.
And we very much focused on like, just because that was something, honestly, like I wanted to talk to you when I heard about your book, when I read your book. And then also I want to just have this link. So when somebody sends me a comment, I can just send them a link to this conversation and be like, here, educate yourself. Here you go.
I'd love to serve that purpose for you.
But your book, I want to mention, like your book has different chapters and each one is a different sort of, is it a tick you call it? So
well, I don't call it a tick, but people call them ticks. Yes.
So you have a chapter about like, you have a chapter about you have a chapter about dude. What are the other ones? You have they, which is that's a whole other conversation. They is a pronoun. Yeah.
Whole other conversation, right? I talk about the history of they and why it bothers us so much. And then one that I think is unexpected, but I love telling people about it because it's so different than what people expect, is past verbal participles. So progressive ing, like walking and talking, that we think of as dropping a G. It's a fascinating history. And in fact, what you learn in that chapter is sort of the big twist is that the ing that we think of as correct is actually historically incorrect. And there are a lot of false beliefs we have about that marker. And when we say people are careless or lazy, if we actually look back at the history of how we evolved that ing progressive marker, it is completely the opposite of what people think.
And I love that you're coming in here, like in your book and on this podcast, just with the facts, because people who just inherently feel this is the rule of grammar, that person is breaking it, I must correct them. And your book really just explains the kind of there are sort of socially acceptable, understood rules, but there's not a book that says here is how speech should be. And yeah, it changes over time. Yeah.
It does. And I think, I'm not telling people they shouldn't have beliefs about grammar. I'm not saying prescriptivism is never appropriate for people and in their lives and their workplaces. That's not my argument here. My argument is prescriptivism is one view, and it's a very recent view. People don't realize that prescriptivism is really only dating back to about the 18th century. These beliefs, these rules that we so firmly believe in, like don't end a sentence with a preposition, don't split your infinitives, those are actually rules that were created by people in the 18th century on the basis of Latin. And they weren't considered even then steadfast rules of English. They were just guidelines of what made more elegant speech to the speakers of that day. So really what I'm trying to argue is if we look at the real linguistic rules, if we understand the cognitive processes and the articulatory forces that really drive language, that created language, that allow language to exist and change and become what we think of as American English or British English or whatever language you're speaking, we will come to understand that the things that we believe so firmly today are really just sort of figments of our standard prescriptivist imagination. And while we can embrace them as social norms, we can embrace them as preferences, we shouldn't be embracing them as good and bad rules, because that is just a fallacy. And so by breaking down the history of all these things, I'm hoping that people will see the science and the history tells us something different than what we often believe based on the things we learn in school.
And what I would add to that is that of course, like everyone has pet peeves. There's things that bother you. And if something bothers you about the way a podcast host talks, then maybe don't leave a bad review. Maybe just stop listening to that podcast. That'd be my advice.
I think that's very good advice.
Thank you so much. I was so excited to talk to you, and thank you for just blowing my mind with your book and with this conversation. It's all so fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for reading it. That means a lot.
Okay, I feel so justified in the way I talk and how it's okay. And, I feel compassion for the haters a bit, maybe. But what a conversation. I had such a fun time talking with her and learning from her. I'm definitely going to follow along her blog now, which she does on Psychology Today. So yeah, Valerie Fridland. Her book is called Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. And she is a professor of linguistics at the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno. And she also did that Great Courses series. So you should watch that too if you use the Great Courses. And this is Vulgar History. And you can keep up with me and this podcast. If you want to send me compliments or hate, you can do that. I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. I'm on TikTok at Vulgar History, I've just been using TikTok for a couple months now, and I'm leaning into it and I'm enjoying it and found a nice community and it's all good vibes. But every now and then, I guess when my TikTok shows up on somebody's For You page who is just horrified, because I talk on my TikTok like I talk on this show, like me. And some people criticize the way I talk on there as well, but whatever, it bounces off me, she says, after having done an hour-long defensive podcast about how I'm fine. I don't know. It's just interesting to me that this is such a consistent thing that so clearly really bothers some people. Use of the word use of the word and you should read this book. So you can also keep up with me. My website is vulgarhistory.com. And we're just getting towards the end of April, and I've been doing this fundraiser all month where we're raising money for the Trevor Project. And I'm selling merch to raise money for Point of Pride. And if you want to help out with this Tits Out for Trans Rights fundraiser, go to vulgarhistory.com/donate, and all the links are there. There's also a little form there. So if you happen to have donated money this month to a trans affirming organization, you can fill out that form, and then I can include you when I do like a tally at the end of the month, and shout outs to all the people who've donated so far. It's really great to see, and it makes me glad to see the Tits Out Brigade being the people who I thought you were, which is awesome people who care about trans rights. And also this past Monday, I was a guest on the Worst Bestsellers podcast, which was a dream I manifested. A while ago, I did an Ask Me Anything on Instagram, and somebody asked, what would be your dream podcast collab? And I said, Worst Bestsellers. And they saw that and they invited me on, and we talk about The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. And it's a really good, fun conversation. If you don't listen to their podcast, I really enjoy it. They also say a normal amount. The two hosts, Renata and Kate. Anyway, so if you want to hear more of me, listen to the Worst Bestsellers podcast because I was a guest. And I think that's all my announcements. Oh, I have the merch store, vulgarhistory.store. And if you use Tits Out, you get free US shipping. Tits Out 10, you get 10% off. And that's also where you can find the merch that we're selling to raise money for Point of Pride. It has the Chevalier d'Eon on it. It's incredible merch. It was designed by a non-binary artist named Jan Jupiter. And it's beyond my expectations. It's such a beautiful design. It says, "We were always here." It shows the Chevalier mid-fencing battle. It looks amazing. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So that's where you can get bonus episodes, etc. Very recently, I just did an emergency bonus episode with Alison Epstein because I was learning about Australian bush rangers, which is a whole thing that, anyway, so if you can hear that, it's on Patreon now, that particular episode. Eventually it'll be on the main feed, but if you can't wait to hear, I have not freaked out about a person in history who came into my life completely randomly since maybe Lola Montez, when I started reading about these Australian bushrangers. Anyway, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. If you pledge $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all the episodes. And if you pledge at least $5 a month, you get the early ad-free access and also the bonus episodes, including Australian bushrangers. Do I do an Australian accent in the episode? If you're on the Patreon, you'll know that the answer is g'day. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I'll talk to you all next time. Keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.